USSR, 52 victims, 12 years, 3 innocent men executed for his crimes. His name was Chikatilo. Imagine you're a child in the Soviet Union in the 1980s. You're standing at a bus stop or a train station, waiting, maybe a little lost, and a friendly, ordinary-looking man approaches you. He's wearing glasses. He's got grey hair. He looks like someone's grandfather. He smiles. He offers to help you get where you're going. He says he has candy, or toys, or that he knows a shortcut through the woods. You trust him, because why wouldn't you? That was the last decision many of his victims ever made. Between 1978 and 1990, Andrei Chikatilo sexually assaulted, murdered, and mutilated at least 52 people, mostly children and young women, across the Soviet Union. He operated for 12 years. He was arrested and released in 1984 because of a bizarre laboratory error involving his blood type. 3 innocent men were executed for murders he had committed, and the Soviet government refused to tell the public the truth about what was happening, because serial killers, they insisted, were a Western problem. They couldn't exist under communism. Chikatilo existed for 12 more years under communism, killing the whole time. This is the story of the Red Ripper of Rostov, one of the most prolific and disturbing serial killers in human history. And it is also the story of the system that helped him stay hidden. To understand Andrei Chikatilo, you have to first understand the world he was born into, because the environment that shaped him was one of the most traumatic in recorded human history. Chikatilo was born on October 16, 1936, in Yabloknoye, a small village in what is now Ukraine, but was then the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. He was born in the aftermath of one of the worst man-made disasters in history, the Holodomor. The Holodomor was a famine engineered by Joseph Stalin's forced collectivization policies. In the early 1930s, farmers were forced to give up their land and crops to the state. The result was catastrophic. Millions of Ukrainians, estimates range from 3.5 million to 7 million or more, starved to death. Villages were stripped bare. People died in the streets, and in the most desperate cases, people resorted to eating whatever they could find, including, in documented cases, other human beings. Chikatilo was born 3 years after the worst of the famine, but its shadow hung over his entire childhood. The village of Yabloknoye existed in the psychological and physical aftermath of mass starvation. Everyone around him had lived through it. Everyone carried its scars. And his mother told him something specific about what had happened to their family. During the famine years, she told him that before he was born, he had had an older brother, a boy named Stepan, who had been kidnapped and eaten by starving neighbors. Whether this story was true has never been established. Stepan Chikatilo may never have existed, but that didn't matter to young Andrei. He was told this story, he believed it, and it lodged in his psychology like a splinter, in a place that would fester for decades. If the shadow of the Holodomor wasn't enough, the next chapter of Chikatilo's childhood was shaped by something even more immediate. World War II. In June 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history, crushing through the Soviet Union's western borders and into Ukraine. The village of Yabloknoye was in the path of the advancing German forces. Chikatilo's father, Roman, was conscripted into the Red Army and sent to fight. He was later wounded and taken prisoner by the Germans. When Roman eventually returned from the war, a captured, broken man, Soviet policy under Stalin treated prisoners of war as traitors or cowards. Roman Chikatilo faced the shame of that stigma for the rest of his life. In her husband's absence, Chikatilo's mother, Anna, struggled to keep the family alive. She was described by those who knew her as a harsh, controlling woman. Young Andrei shared a bed with her. He had no privacy, no space of his own. During the Nazi occupation of Ukraine, Andrei witnessed things no child should ever see. Bombings, executions, bodies in the streets. He later told investigators that during this period, he developed fantasies about leading German prisoners into the woods and killing them, fantasies he described as a common childhood daydream for Soviet boys of that era. But looking back, investigators noted how closely those fantasies mirrored the specific nature of his later crimes, luring people into forests to kill them. The war also meant starvation continued. Chikatilo later claimed that for much of his childhood, he had not eaten bread. He and his family ate grass, leaves, and whatever they could find. He claimed he did not eat bread regularly until he was 12 years old. He was small, weak, malnourished, and deeply afraid. And he wet the bed well into his adolescence, something his mother punished him for with public humiliation and beatings. This was the foundation on which Andrei Chikatilo was built. As Chikatilo entered adolescence, life at school was, if anything, even more painful than life at home. He was small and physically weak. He was bullied constantly. He struggled academically at first. Though he was intelligent, he had very few friends and essentially no social skills. He was unable to understand how to connect with other people. And the more he failed to connect, the more isolated he became. He was also, from a very early age, struggling with what he would later describe as sexual dysfunction. He had chronic, persistent impotence. He simply could not achieve or sustain an erection under normal circumstances. At age 15, he had what he later described as his only sexual experience as a teenager. He attempted to overpower a younger girl, the sister of a friend, and ejaculated immediately and involuntarily during their brief physical struggle. Before anything else could happen, the girl told people what happened. He was mocked. The humiliation burned into him. Girls were going behind my back, whispering that I was impotent, he told investigators years later. I was so ashamed. I tried to hang myself. My mother and some neighbors pulled me out of the noose. Well, I thought no one would want such a shamed man. That suicide attempt was in his adolescence. He survived, and the shame stayed with him, brewing, festering, for decades. He was rejected from university on his first attempt, despite being a good student, and spent 2 years in technical school instead. He then served his compulsory military service in the Soviet Army between 1957 and 1960, 3 years in which, by all accounts, he continued to struggle socially and was the target of ongoing ridicule from fellow soldiers over his lack of sexual experience and inability to form any relationships. After his military service, Chikatilo did something that would define the next decade of his life. He built a mask of normalcy, a very convincing mask. He completed a correspondence degree in Russian literature in 1971. He got a teaching job in the town of Novoshoktink, teaching Russian language and literature to children. He was a poor teacher in terms of discipline and classroom management. Students didn't respect him, but for a period, he was there, functioning, appearing normal. In 1963, through an arrangement essentially organized by his younger sister, who felt sorry for him, he married a woman named Faina. She later said she had no idea the extent of his sexual dysfunction until after the wedding. Their sex life was essentially non-existent, but somehow, reportedly through a combination of manual stimulation and extraordinary persistence, they did conceive 2 children, a daughter, Lyudmila, and a son, Yuri. On the surface, a married man, a teacher, a father, a member of the Communist Party. Inside, a man who had not resolved a single one of his deep psychological fractures. A man who still carried the childhood trauma of famine stories, wartime violence, parental humiliation, and decades of sexual failure and shame. A man whose inner world was darkening by the year, and there were warning signs, early, clear warning signs that were ignored. While working as a teacher in Novoshoktink, Chikatilo was repeatedly accused by students and parents of inappropriate touching and sexual misconduct with students. Complaints were filed against him multiple times, Each time, the school system transferred him to a different school, rather than reporting him to police or taking serious action. He moved from school to school, leaving a trail of complaints, and the Soviet educational system shuffled him along, closing its eyes. In 1978, Chikatilo made a move that would prove fateful. He relocated to the town of Shakhty in the Rostov Oblast region of Russia, taking a job as a supply clerk for a local factory. The job required him to travel frequently across the region, across the Soviet Union, giving him access to train stations, bus depots, and the anonymity that comes with being a constant traveler. In a country of hundreds of millions of people, he also secretly purchased a small, run-down shack on the outskirts of Shakhty. He told no one about it. Not his wife. Not anyone. On December 22, 1978, 2 days before Christmas, Chikatilo lured a 9-year-old girl named Lena Zakotnova to his secret shack. He attempted to rape her. She fought back. He could not achieve an erection. And then he stabbed her. And in the moments of stabbing her, he achieved sexual release for the first time in his adult life. He realized in that moment, with nauseating clarity, what his body required in order to function. He threw her body into the Grushevka River. She was found 3 days later. A witness had seen Chikatilo with the girl shortly before her disappearance. Police investigated him, but an alibi provided by his wife allowed him to slip through their grasp. Instead, police arrested a 25-year-old local man named Alexander Kravchenko, who had a previous rape conviction. Under what is widely believed to have been a brutal forced interrogation, Kravchenko confessed to the murder of Lena Zakotnova. He was tried, convicted, and executed in 1984. He was innocent. He died for Chikatilo's crime. After his close brush with investigation, Chikatilo went quiet for 3 years. He transferred to a different school, still ignoring the complaints about his behavior, and tried to maintain his mask of normality. In 1978, Chikatilo made a move that would prove fateful. He relocated to the town of Shakhty in the Rostov Oblast region of Russia, taking a job as a supply clerk for a local factory. The job required him to travel frequently across the region, across the Soviet Union, giving him access to train stations, bus depots, and the anonymity that comes with being a constant traveler. In a country of hundreds of millions of people, in September 1981, Chikatilo killed again. By this point, he had lost his teaching position entirely. Fired after another complaint of inappropriate conduct with a student, he was now working full-time as a supply clerk, traveling constantly across the Rostov region and beyond. He had access to train stations and bus stops in dozens of cities and towns. He had anonymity, and he had a briefcase. His method crystallized during this period into something terrifyingly consistent. He would station himself at train stations, bus depots, markets, anywhere where young people, runaways, or the vulnerable might be waiting or searching for direction. He would approach them in the guise of a helpful, friendly older man, a grandfather type. Harmless. He offered things: food, money, a shortcut, a place to stay, Western movies at his home. Once he had lured his victim away from public spaces into a secluded area, typically wooded strips alongside rail lines, areas locals called Lesopolosa. The situation changed completely. He would sexually assault his victims, and when his impotence prevented conventional assaults, he would use his knife, stabbing, slashing, mutilating, and achieve his only possible sexual release through the act of killing and the suffering of his victims. He targeted the eyes first, gouging them out or slashing across the sockets. He later told investigators this was because he had heard a superstition that a murder victim's eyes retained the image of their killer even after death. He believed it. He was terrified of it. He had to remove the eyes. He also mutilated the genitals and other body parts of many victims. He removed nipples, noses, tongues. In several cases, he consumed parts of his victims, confirming what that terrible story about his brother had lodged deep inside his psychology. Between 1981 and 1982, he killed at least 8 people. His victims ranged from young girls to teenage boys to adult women. All of them lured the same way. All of them killed in the woods. And nobody connected any of it. Not yet. In 1978, Chikatilo made a move that would prove fateful. He relocated to the town of Shakhty in the Rostov Oblast region of Russia, taking a job as a supply clerk for a local factory. The job required him to travel frequently, across the region, across the Soviet Union, giving him access to train stations, bus depots, and the anonymity that comes with being a constant traveler in a country of hundreds of millions of people. In September 1981, Chikatilo killed again. By this point, he had lost his teaching position entirely. Fired after another complaint of inappropriate conduct with a student, he was now working full-time as a supply clerk, traveling constantly across the Rostov region and beyond. He had access to train stations and bus stops in dozens of cities and towns. He had anonymity, and he had a briefcase. His method crystallized during this period into something terrifyingly consistent. By 1983, the bodies could no longer be ignored. Investigators across the Rostov region had been finding victims with disturbingly similar wound patterns for years. The mutilations, the injuries, the evidence of frenzied stabbing. But the Soviet system had a fundamental problem. It didn't believe serial killers existed in communist society. This wasn't ignorance. It was official ideology. Serial murder, the kind driven by psychological deviance and sexual pathology, was categorized by Soviet authorities as a Western phenomenon, a product of capitalism, something that happened in America or Western Europe, born from the decadence and moral corruption of those systems. In the USSR, the media was state-controlled. Police were forbidden from issuing public warnings about a serial killer on the loose, because to do so would be to admit that such a person could exist. So the public, parents, children, everyone, was kept in the dark. No warnings, no descriptions, no official acknowledgement. Meanwhile, Chikatilo killed 15 more people in 1984 alone. In 1983, Moscow Detective Major Mikhail Fetisov assumed central control of the investigation. He recognized, despite the official ideology, that a serial killer was operating in the Rostov region. He assigned a specialist forensic investigator named Viktor Burakov to lead the hunt. Burakov was meticulous and dedicated. He began building a proper case file, cross-referencing all known victims and their wounds. By this time, forensic evidence from multiple crime scenes had established one key detail about the killer. He had blood type AB, based on semen samples recovered from several scenes. That blood type detail would become one of the most consequential forensic mistakes in the history of criminal investigation. In 1984, with 15 new victims added in a single year, Burakov intensified operations. Police flooded train stations and bus depots across the Rostov region with plainclothes officers. Every suspicious man was watched. On September 13, 1984, at a bus station in Rostov, a plainclothes officer observed a middle-aged man in glasses behaving strangely, hovering near young women and children, making repeated attempts at conversation, loitering with obvious purpose. Officers detained him. Inside his briefcase, a long knife, a length of rope, and a jar of lubricant. His name was Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo. He was 47 years old. He matched several aspects of the emerging profile investigators had been building. He had previous complaints of sexual misconduct with students on his record. He was connected to the Shakhty area where early murders had occurred. He was a frequent traveler with access to all the relevant locations. They had him. He was right there. And then the blood test came back. The forensic evidence from the crime scenes pointed to blood type AB. Chikatilo was tested. His blood came back as type A. The two didn't match, and Soviet forensic procedure at the time was clear. Blood type was blood type. If it didn't match, you had the wrong man. What investigators did not know What virtually no one in Soviet forensic science knew at the time was that Chikatilo had an extraordinarily rare biological condition. He was a non-secretor, a member of a small genetic minority in whom the blood type present in bodily fluids like saliva and semen does not match the blood type in actual blood. His blood was type A, his semen was type AB. He was literally his own biological alibi. This condition was not fully understood or accounted for in Soviet forensic protocols, and so Chikatilo was released. He was held briefly on unrelated theft charges, minor offenses, and released in December 1984. He resumed killing almost immediately. 3 innocent men were ultimately executed for murders Chikatilo had committed. The Soviet state, which had declared serial killers impossible in communist society, was executing its own innocent citizens for crimes committed by the man it had decided could not exist. After Chikatilo's release in 1984, Detective Burakov was desperate. The official approach, surveillance, mass questioning, blood type matching, had failed. The killings had slowed during the surveillance operations, but resumed with new intensity after the release. So Burakov made a decision that was, in the context of Soviet law enforcement, genuinely radical. He approached a psychiatrist, Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky was a specialist in sexual disorders based in Rostov. He had never worked with law enforcement before. In the Soviet Union, criminal profiling simply did not exist as a discipline. But Burakov gave Bukhanovsky access to all of the case files, crime scene photos, autopsy reports, forensic evidence, victim profiles, and asked him to do something unprecedented: describe the man who had committed these crimes. Bukhanovsky's resulting profile was 65 pages long, and it was remarkable. He described a man between 45 and 50 years old, a man who had endured a painful, isolated childhood with little or no meaningful human connection, a man who was almost certainly impotent, whose only sexual release came through the act of killing, a man who was likely educated and intelligent but unable to form normal social bonds, a man who was married, possibly with children, but who had a wife who expected little or no sexual intimacy from him, a man with a compulsion he could not control. Almost every detail fit Andrei Chikatilo with uncanny precision, but at the time, investigators didn't have Chikatilo's full profile in front of them, and the blood type issue had cleared him. Bukhanovsky's profile sat in the files, unused for years. It would eventually be the key to breaking Chikatilo open, but not yet. The two didn't match, and Soviet forensic procedure at the time was clear. Blood type was blood type. If it didn't match, you had the wrong man. What investigators did not know, what virtually no one in Soviet forensic science knew at the time, was that Chikatilo had an extraordinarily rare biological condition. He was a non-secretor, a member of a small genetic minority in whom the blood type present in bodily fluids like saliva and semen does not match the blood type in actual blood. His blood was type A, his semen was type AB. He was literally his own biological alibi. This condition was not fully understood or accounted for in Soviet forensic protocols, and so Chikatilo was released. He was held briefly on unrelated theft charges, minor offenses, and released in December 1984. He resumed killing almost immediately. 3 innocent men were ultimately executed for murders Chikatilo had committed. The Soviet state, which had declared serial killers impossible in communist society, was executing its own innocent citizens for crimes committed by the man it had decided could not exist. With Chikatilo free, the murders continued year after year. In 1985, he killed 6 people. In 1986, 5 more. During these years, some of his murders occurred far outside the Rostov region, during business trips to other parts of the Soviet Union. These murders weren't initially connected to the Rostov killings, because investigators in different Soviet republics weren't sharing information effectively. Some bodies were never found until Chikatilo himself led police to them years later. In 1987, he killed 3 more. In 1988, the pace accelerated again. In 1989, 9 victims. Then, in 1990, he killed 9 more people, including children as young as 7 years old. He was killing more frequently, more recklessly, and with increasing savagery. The victims in his final years included more young boys than before, a shift in targeting that investigators noted and tried to analyze. Throughout these years, victims' families waited for answers. The Soviet state continued its policy of suppression, barely acknowledging the killings publicly, offering no meaningful warnings to parents or communities. As rumors spread among local populations, whispered stories about a monster in the woods, about foreigners kidnapping Soviet boys, about werewolves, the official government position remained one of denial and minimization. Burakov and his team, meanwhile, were consumed by the case. They had interviewed more than 100,000 people. They had checked over 500,000 individuals. They had followed up on thousands of leads that went nowhere. At one point, in an almost unprecedented move for Soviet law enforcement, Burakov even visited a convicted serial killer named Anatoly Slivko in prison, just weeks before Slivko's own execution, to try to gain psychological insights into the mind of their unknown killer. The investigation was exhausting everyone, and Chikatilo kept killing. The two didn't match, and Soviet forensic procedure at the time was clear. Blood type was blood type. If it didn't match, you had the wrong man. What investigators did not know, what virtually no one in Soviet forensic science knew at the time, was that Chikatilo had an extraordinarily rare biological condition. He was a non-secretor, a member of a small genetic minority in whom the blood type present in bodily fluids like saliva and semen does not match the blood type in actual blood. His blood was type A, his semen was type O. He was literally his own biological alibi. This condition was not fully understood or accounted for in Soviet forensic protocols, and so Chikatilo was released. He was held briefly on unrelated theft charges, minor offenses, and released in December 1984. He resumed killing almost immediately. 3 innocent men were ultimately executed for murders Chikatilo had committed. The Soviet state, which had declared serial killers impossible in communist society, was executing its own innocent citizens for crimes committed by the man it had decided could not exist. On November 6, 1990, Andrei Chikatilo committed his final murder. He encountered a 22-year-old woman named Sveta Korostik near Donlesko station, a small train stop outside Rostov. He lured her into the nearby woods. He killed her there. When he emerged from the tree line afterward, he had blood on his face and a fresh cut on his hand. A patrolman stationed near the station noticed him. In the Soviet Union's now intensified operation targeting train stations and wooded areas around Rostov, every suspicious individual was logged. The patrolman noted Chikatilo's details and filed a report. That report landed on Viktor Burakov's desk. Burakov looked at the name. He knew Andrei Chikatilo had been on a suspect list as far back as 1987, a list that had been assembled by Burakov's team using updated criteria. His name had appeared, but the blood type discrepancy had kept him off the primary suspect list. Now, with a fresh suspicious behavior report placing him at a crime scene location just days before a body would be found in those exact woods, Burakov moved. Chikatilo was placed under surveillance on November 20, 1990. Officers followed him for days, watching this grey-haired, bespectacled, utterly ordinary-looking man buy beer, visit a medical clinic, ride the bus, go about what looked like the completely mundane routine of a retired grandfather. Then, on November 20th, they arrested him. He was 54 years old. He had been killing for 12 years. The two didn't match, and Soviet forensic procedure at the time was clear. Blood type was blood type. If it didn't match, you had the wrong man. What investigators did not know, what virtually no one in Soviet forensic science knew at the time, was that Chikatilo had an extraordinarily rare biological condition. He was a non-secretor, a member of a small genetic minority in whom the blood type present in bodily fluids like saliva And semen does not match the blood type in actual blood. His blood was type A. His semen was type AB. He was literally his own biological alibi. This condition was not fully understood or accounted for in Soviet forensic protocols. And so Chikatilo was released. He was held briefly on unrelated theft charges, minor offenses, and released in December 1984. He resumed killing almost immediately. 3 innocent men were ultimately executed for murders Chikatilo had committed. The Soviet state, which had declared serial killers impossible in communist society, was executing its own innocent citizens for crimes committed by the man it had decided could not exist. When Chikatilo was brought into custody, he said almost nothing. He denied everything. The hardline interrogators who tried to break him through confrontation and pressure got nowhere. Days passed. The window for holding him without formal charges was closing. And then Viktor Burakov made the call that changed everything. He brought in Dr. Bukhanovsky, the psychiatrist who had written the 65-page profile 6 years earlier. Bukhanovsky arrived not as an interrogator, not as a police agent. He presented himself to Chikatilo as a scientist, someone who was writing a study on criminal psychology and wanted to understand the mind of someone like Chikatilo, not to judge him, not to condemn him, but to understand him. For a man who had spent his entire life feeling unseen, mocked, dismissed, and invisible, the idea that someone of authority and intelligence was treating him as a subject of genuine intellectual interest was overwhelming. Bukhanovsky sat with Chikatilo alone. He read extracts from his 65-page profile out loud to him, describing in precise, clinical, compassionate detail the psychology of a person like Chikatilo, the childhood trauma, the humiliation, the impotence, the rage, the specific way in which violence had become the only available substitute for intimacy. As Bukhanovsky read, Chikatilo began to shake. According to witnesses who spoke to Bukhanovsky afterward, tears ran down Chikatilo's face. He was trembling. He had spent decades convinced that no one could ever understand him, that the thing inside him was so alien, so private, so incomprehensible that no one would ever see it clearly. And here was this psychiatrist, reading it back to him, accurately, precisely, without judgment. Within 2 hours, Chikatilo confessed. He didn't just confirm the murders investigators knew about. He told them about all of them. Between November 30th and December 5th, 1990, he confessed to 56 murders. Police had suspected 36. The additional 20 were names, locations, dates, and specific details that only the person who had been there could possibly know. He led investigators to burial sites, bodies that had never been found, that had been in shallow graves in the woods for years. The two didn't match, and Soviet forensic procedure at the time was clear. Blood type was blood type. If it didn't match, you had the wrong man. What investigators did not know, what virtually no one in Soviet forensic science knew at the time, was that Chikatilo had an extraordinarily rare biological condition. He was a non-secretor, a member of a small genetic minority in whom the blood type present in bodily fluids like saliva and semen does not match the blood type in actual blood. His blood was type A. His semen was type AB. He was literally his own biological alibi. This condition was not fully understood or accounted for in Soviet forensic protocols, and so Chikatilo was released. He was held briefly on unrelated theft charges, minor offenses, and released in December 1984. He resumed killing almost immediately. 3 innocent men were ultimately executed for murders Chikatilo had committed. The Soviet state, which had declared serial killers impossible in communist society, was executing its own innocent citizens for crimes committed by the man it had decided could not exist. The trial of Andrei Chikatilo opened on April 14, 1992, in Rostov-on-Don, the city at the center of his killing zone. Nothing could have prepared the public for what the next several months would look like. The courtroom was packed. Families of victims had traveled from across the Soviet Union, which had now collapsed. replaced by the Russian Federation, to witness the proceedings. Outside the courthouse, hundreds of people gathered every day. Many of them were the parents, siblings, and spouses of the dead. Some had been waiting more than a decade for this moment. To protect Chikatilo from the crowd, he was placed in an iron cage in the center of the courtroom for the entire duration of the trial. An actual metal cage, like something you'd see at a zoo. And from inside that cage, Chikatilo proceeded to behave in ways that bewildered everyone. He sang, he shouted nonsense, he rambled about being bombarded with radiation that was destroying his sexuality. He dropped his trousers. He claimed to be a woman. He stood up and delivered incoherent speeches at completely random moments. He screamed that he was a victim. He alternately denied everything and admitted to things he hadn't been charged with. Whether this behavior was genuine psychosis, a calculated attempt to establish an insanity defense, or simply the complete collapse of a man who had spent 12 years maintaining a functional mask, forensic psychiatrists still disagree to this day. What was clear was that the victims' families were incensed. At multiple points during the trial, courtroom proceedings had to be paused because family members lunged toward the cage, screaming, trying to reach him. The pain in that room was immense. The defense argued insanity. Dr. Buchanovsky, who had profiled Chikatilo and extracted his confession, assessed him as fit to stand trial. A Moscow psychiatrist named Dr. Andrei concurred. Chikatilo was diagnosed with sadism and borderline personality disorder, but was found legally sane, meaning he understood the nature of his actions and their consequences. The verdict came on October 14, 1992. Judge Leonid Akubzanov announced that Chikatilo was guilty of 52 of the 53 murders, for which he had been tried. He received a death sentence for each offense, 50 to death sentences. The judge also used the occasion to publicly criticize the prosecution's department, specifically lead procurator Issakostuev, for investigative negligence that had contributed to Chikatilo's freedom for years. Chikatilo stood in his cage as the verdict was read. He was screaming again. The families wept. Some were too devastated to react at all. The two didn't match, and Soviet forensic procedure at the time was clear. Blood type was blood type. If it didn't match, you had the wrong man. What investigators did not know, what virtually no one in Soviet forensic science knew at the time, was that Chikatilo had an extraordinarily rare biological condition. He was a non-secretor, a member of a small genetic minority in whom the blood type present in bodily fluids like saliva and semen does not match the blood type in actual blood. His blood was type A, his semen was type AB. He was literally his own biological alibi. This condition was not fully understood or accounted for in Soviet forensic protocols, and so Chikatilo was released. He was held briefly on unrelated theft charges, minor offenses, and released in December 1984. He resumed killing almost immediately. 3 innocent men were ultimately executed for murders Chikatilo had committed. The Soviet state, which had declared serial killers impossible in communist society, was executing its own innocent citizens for crimes committed by the man it had decided could not exist. Chikatilo appealed his verdict to the Russian Supreme Court. In 1993, the court reviewed the case and ruled that insufficient evidence existed for 9 of the convictions, reducing the confirmed count to 52. The rest of the death sentences stood. On February 14, 1994, Valentine's Day, Andrei Chikatilo was executed in Moscow. The method of execution in the Russian Federation at that time was a single gunshot to the back of the head, the same swift, quiet method that had been used throughout Soviet history. Chikatilo made no final statement, no acknowledgement of his victims, no words for the families, nothing that any of them would have found meaningful anyway. He was 57 years old. Before his execution, he had been asked whether he felt any remorse. His response has been quoted in various forms by investigators who were present. The most consistent version: he expressed something about feeling like a mistake of nature. He did not weep for his victims. He wept, when he wept at all, for himself. Outside, when news of the execution was announced, there was no crowd, no celebration. Many of the families were simply relieved it was over. For some of them, it had been 15 or 16 years since their child or sister or mother had vanished in a railway station forest in southern Russia. The Soviet Union no longer existed. The world had changed completely, and the man who had killed their loved ones was finally gone. But for the families, there is no such thing as closure. There are only days that get slightly easier. The two didn't match, and Soviet forensic procedure at the time was clear. Blood type was blood type. If it didn't match, you had the wrong man. What investigators did not know, what virtually no one in Soviet forensic science knew at the time, was that Chikatilo had an extraordinarily rare biological condition. He was a non-secretor, a member of a small genetic minority in whom the blood type present in bodily fluids like saliva and semen does not match the blood type in actual blood. His blood was type A. His semen was type AB. He was literally his own biological alibi. This condition was not fully understood or accounted for in Soviet forensic protocols, and so Chikatilo was released. He was held briefly on unrelated theft charges, minor offenses, and released in December 1984. He resumed killing almost immediately. 3 innocent men were ultimately executed for murders Chikatilo had committed. The Soviet state, which had declared serial killers impossible in communist society, was executing its own innocent citizens for crimes committed by the man it had decided could not exist. I want to stop here, before we talk about legacy, before we talk about documentaries and cultural impact, and spend some time with the people who were actually lost. 52 confirmed victims, 52 real people, most of them children. The youngest was 7 years old. Many of them were children who had been sent to run an errand at the market, or catch a train, or get something from a bus station. Many were runaways, teenagers who had fled difficult home situations and were living by their wits, on the margins of Soviet society, sleeping in stations and eating whatever they could find. Some were young women traveling alone. A few were adult men who were homeless or mentally disabled. Chikatilo selected them precisely because they were the people nobody was looking for very hard. The runaways, the homeless, the children of poor families in a society that had limited resources for anyone. These were the cracks in Soviet society that Chikatilo fell through again and again. For 12 years. Among his victims, Lena Zakotnova, 9, whose murder sent an innocent man to his death. Lyubov Biryuk, 13, murdered in 1982. Her case was the one that finally forced Soviet authorities to officially acknowledge a serial killer was at work. Ivan Fomin, 7, one of the youngest victims. Sveta Korostik, 22, the last. Some families waited years to learn what had happened to their missing child. Some were informed during the trial. Some families learned that Chikatilo had buried their loved one in a remote location, and only knew the location because he led investigators there after his arrest. Without his confession, those bodies might never have been found. The two didn't match, and Soviet forensic procedure at the time was clear. Blood type was blood type. If it didn't match, you had the wrong man. What investigators did not know, what virtually no one in Soviet forensic science knew at the time, was that Chikatilo had an extraordinarily rare biological condition. He was a non-secretor, a member of a small genetic minority in whom the blood type present in bodily fluids like saliva and semen does not match the blood type in actual blood. His blood was type A. His semen was type AB. He was literally his own biological alibi. This condition was not fully understood or accounted for in Soviet forensic protocols, and so Chikatilo was released. He was held briefly on unrelated theft charges, minor offenses, and released in December 1984. He resumed killing almost immediately. 3 innocent men were ultimately executed for murders Chikatilo had committed. The Soviet state, which had declared serial killers impossible in communist society, was executing its own innocent citizens for crimes committed by the man it had decided could not exist. The Chikatilo case is not just the story of a monster. It is also the story of a system that made him possible, and that sacrificed innocent people in its refusal to confront him. At least 3 innocent men were convicted of murders Chikatilo committed and were executed. Alexander Kravchenko, executed in 1984 for the murder of Lena Zakotnova in 1978. 2 additional men were executed in the 1980s for other murders in Chikatilo's series. 3 men killed by the state for crimes they did not commit. This happened because of a combination of factors. Soviet police relied heavily on forced confessions extracted through brutal interrogation. The state ideology that denied the existence of serial killers meant investigators couldn't properly conceptualize what they were dealing with. And the blood type forensic era, the non-secretor condition, gave Chikatilo a biological shield that no one understood until too late. The Soviet media suppression also meant the public was denied information that might have helped them protect themselves and their children. Parents weren't warned. Children weren't warned. The state shows its image over the safety of its citizens. Dr. Bukhanovsky, the psychiatrist who created the profile and extracted the confession, later became one of Russia's foremost experts on sexual disorders and criminal psychology. He dedicated his career to building the very field that barely existed in the Soviet Union. At the time of the Chikatilo investigation, he essentially helped create Russian forensic psychiatry from scratch. Detective Viktor Burakov, who spent 8 years hunting Chikatilo against every institutional obstacle imaginable, went on to write a memoir about the investigation. The Killer Department, which became the basis for the 1995 HBO film Citizen X. The two didn't match, and Soviet forensic procedure at the time was clear. Blood type was blood type. If it didn't match, you had the wrong man. What investigators did not know, what virtually no one in Soviet forensic science knew at the time, was that Chikatilo had an extraordinarily rare biological condition. He was a non-secretor, a member of a small genetic minority in whom the blood type present in bodily fluids like saliva and semen does not match the blood type in actual blood. His blood was type A. His semen was type O. He was literally his own biological alibi. This condition was not fully understood or accounted for in Soviet forensic protocols, and so Chikatilo was released. He was held briefly on unrelated theft charges, minor offenses, and released in December 1984. He resumed killing almost immediately. 3 innocent men were ultimately executed for murders Chikatilo had committed. The Soviet state, which had declared serial killers impossible in communist society, was executing its own innocent citizens for crimes committed by the man it had decided could not exist. The Chikatilo case changed criminal investigation in Russia and the former Soviet Union permanently. Before Chikatilo, criminal profiling did not exist as a discipline in Soviet law enforcement. After Chikatilo, Dr. Bukhanovsky's model, using psychological profiles to understand and predict criminal behavior, became foundational to Russian forensic practice. The case also forced Russian investigators to develop protocols for handling evidence from different bodily fluids separately. The non-secretor issue that had allowed Chikatilo to escape in 1984 would never again be allowed to make that kind of catastrophic difference. The case also forced a public reckoning with the reality that serial killers could, and did, exist under communism. The ideology that had protected Chikatilo by denying his existence was publicly exposed as both dangerous and wrong. In popular culture, the Chikatilo case has been depicted in multiple forms. The 1995 HBO film Citizen X, starring Stephen Ray as Viktor Burakov, Donald Sutherland as Colonel Fetisov, and Max von Sydow as Dr. Bukhanovsky, is widely considered one of the best true crime films ever made. It holds an 86% score on Rotten Tomatoes. The 2004 film Ivalenko, starring Malcolm McDowell, loosely dramatized the murders, and the case has been the subject of numerous documentaries and true crime series over the decades. The two didn't match, and Soviet forensic procedure at the time was clear. Blood type was blood type. If it didn't match, you had the wrong man. What investigators did not know, what virtually no one in Soviet forensic science knew at the time, was that Chikatilo had an extraordinarily rare biological condition. He was a non-secretor, a member of a small genetic minority in whom the blood type present in bodily fluids like saliva and semen does not match the blood type in actual blood. His blood was type A, his semen was type AB. He was literally his own biological alibi. This condition was not fully understood or accounted for in Soviet forensic protocols, and so Chikatilo was released. He was held briefly on unrelated theft charges, minor offenses, and released in December 1984. He resumed killing almost immediately. 3 innocent men were ultimately executed for murders Chikatilo had committed. The Soviet state, which had declared serial killers impossible in communist society, was executing its own innocent citizens for crimes committed by the man it had decided could not exist. Andrei Chikatilo murdered at least 52 people between 1978 and 1990, possibly more. He was executed on February 14, 1994. He killed for 12 years. In part because a system built on ideology rather than truth refused to acknowledge that he could exist. 3 innocent men died for his crimes. Dozens of families went years without knowing what had happened to their loved ones. The lesson of this case is not just about one man's psychopathology. It's about what happens when a government prioritizes its image over the safety of its people, when ideology overrides evidence, when the truth becomes inconvenient. In memory of the victims: Lena Zakotnova, Lyubov Biryuk, Lyuba Volobweva, Laura Sarkisyan, Masha Ryabenko, Ivan Fomin, Sveta Korostik, and all 52 names, children and young people whose lives were stolen in the forests of Soviet Russia. If this case affected you and you want to learn more, check out Citizen X on HBO. It is one of the most accurate and devastating true crime films ever made. If you're new here, this is Dark Crime. We don't look away. Subscribe, leave your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.